Staff Sergeant Elena Vasquez pushed through the heavy door of the Tactical Operations Center, the weight of her intelligence briefing materials balanced against her hip. The fluorescent lights hummed overhead, casting the windowless room in that particular shade of institutional brightness that made everyone look slightly ill. 12 Navy SEALs occupied the folding chairs arranged before the main display screen, their postures radiating the particular brand of relaxed confidence that came from years of being the most dangerous people in any room they entered. Senior Chief Marcus Webb stood at the head of the table with his arms crossed over his chest, his expression settling into something between tolerance and irritation as he watched her approach. He was broad across the shoulders in the way of men who had spent decades carrying heavy loads across hostile terrain, his close-cropped gray hair suggesting the 20-plus years of combat deployments that his classified service record would confirm. "This is our intelligence support from Marine Corps liaison," Webb announced to the room, his hand gesturing vaguely in her direction. "Staff Sergeant Vasquez will be providing mission context for tonight's operation." The introduction carried no mention of her military occupational specialty, no reference to her background, nothing that might suggest she was anything other than an administrative attachment who happened to wear a uniform. Vasquez noted the omission without reaction, her face maintaining the neutral professionalism she had perfected over years of operating in spaces where her presence was questioned before she spoke a single word. A whisper carried from the second row, just loud enough to reach her ears. Petty Officer First Class Danny Chun leaned toward the operator beside him, his voice pitched at that particular frequency men used when they wanted to be overheard while maintaining deniability. "Great," he muttered. "Another PowerPoint Ranger. Just what we need on a direct action mission." Scattered chuckles rippled through the seated operators. Vasquez absorbed the comment with the same expression she might use to note the weather. Acknowledged, cataloged, irrelevant to the task at hand. She had heard variations of this sentiment in a dozen different tactical operations centers across 3 continents. The words changed, but the assumption remained constant. She looked like someone who pushed papers. Therefore, she must be someone who pushed papers. She stepped to the display screen and pulled up the first image, a satellite overview of their target compound nestled in a narrow valley between 3 converging ridgelines. The terrain was brutal, all sharp angles and limited sight lines, the kind of geography that had been swallowing military operations since Alexander first marched through these mountains. "The primary objective is located here," Vasquez began, her pointer indicating the central structure. "High-value target confirmed present as of 0400 local. Standard security contingent of 8 to 12 personnel within the compound itself." She paused, advancing to the next image. This showed the same terrain from a different angle, with 3 positions circled in red on the surrounding ridges. "However," she continued, "drone surveillance has not identified what I assess to be 3 distinct overwatch positions on the eastern, southern, and western ridgelines. Microterrain analysis of shadow patterns and vegetation disturbance suggests these positions have been occupied within the last 72 hours. Webb's hand came up, cutting her off mid-sentence. His expression had shifted from tolerance to something approaching condescension. "Staff Sergeant, my team has been running operations in this AO for 8 months. I think we understand the threat picture a little better than someone reading satellite imagery from a desk." His voice carried the patient tone of a man explaining something obvious to someone slow. "We appreciate the context, but let's stick to target confirmation and leave the tactical assessment to the operators." Vasquez met his gaze without flinching. She could have mentioned the 3 years she spent in this exact province, could have referenced the operations she had conducted in terrain identical to what showed on the screen behind her. She could have explained why she was certain about those ridgeline positions, why the particular pattern of ground disturbance was as clear to her as a neon sign. Instead, she simply nodded. "Of course, Senior Chief. I am simply presenting the intelligence picture as I assess it. Your team will make its own tactical determinations." Now, wherever you are watching from right now, whether you are in California or Texas or somewhere overseas, think about a time when someone dismissed what you had to say before you even finished speaking. That moment when you knew something important, something that mattered, and the people who needed to hear it had already decided you had nothing worth hearing. Hold on to that feeling, because what happens next is going to show exactly what that kind of assumption can cost. Chun snorted from his seat. Intel types always see threats behind every rock. That is what happens when you never actually leave the wire. The comment drew another round of quiet laughter. Webb did not silence it. Vasquez closed her briefing folder. The three threat positions remained on the screen behind her, red circles marking locations that would matter very much in approximately 6 hours. She had done what she could within the constraints of her assigned role. The rest would unfold according to decisions made by men who had already concluded she had nothing to teach them. She gathered her materials and moved toward the door, passing close enough to Chen's row that she could have reached out and touched his shoulder. His smirk followed her across the room. In the hallway outside, she paused just long enough to pull her phone from her pocket and send a single text message to a number she had memorized years ago. It contained only 3 words. They do not know. The response came back within seconds, from a Marine gunnery sergeant named Torres who would be driving one of the support vehicles on tonight's operation. They will. The vehicle's staging area sat in pre-dawn darkness, the only illumination coming from red-filtered tactical lights that preserved night vision while allowing the operators to conduct final equipment checks. For armored vehicles idled in formation, their diesel engines rumbling low enough to feel through the packed earth beneath Danny Chen's boots. He watched the Marine intelligence officer approach the convoy from across the staging area. She carried only a small assault pack slung over one shoulder, no visible long weapon, no kit beyond the standard body armor that looked slightly too clean for someone who had supposedly served in theater. The observation confirmed what he had already concluded during the briefing. She was a staff creature, someone who had probably qualified on the basic rifle course and thought that made her tactical. Webb intercepted Vasquez before she could reach the lead vehicles where the assault element was loading. Chen could not hear the exchange, but the body language communicated clearly enough. Webb pointed toward the rear of the convoy, his gesture carrying the dismissive efficiency of a man redirecting someone to their proper place. Vasquez turned without argument and walked toward the trail vehicle. Chen nudged the operator beside him. Senior Chief is putting her with the support element. Probably does not want her underfoot when things go loud. Smart call, the other SEAL replied. Last thing we need is some analyst freezing up in the middle of a compound clearance. The trail vehicle was a hulking MRAP that would carry the combat support personnel, the ones who would establish a perimeter and provide extraction support while the assault team conducted the actual mission. It was where you put people who needed to be present but not involved. Chun felt a small satisfaction at seeing the proper order of things maintained. What he did not see was the exchange that occurred when Vasquez reached that vehicle. Gunnery Sergeant Torres stood beside the MRAP's rear hatch, running a final check on the mounted weapon system. He was thick through the chest and shoulders, his face carrying the weathered quality of a man who had spent more years in combat zones than he had spent stateside. When he saw Vasquez approaching, his expression shifted into something that looked almost like relief. Frost, he said, the single word carrying weight that her rank and name had not. Good to see you. Was starting to think they sent someone else. Vasquez stopped beside him, her eyes scanning the convoy ahead with professional assessment. They needed someone who could read terrain. I was available. Torres glanced toward the lead vehicles where the SEALs were completing their preparations. Do they know who they have? The question hung in the cool mountain air. Vasquez watched Webb climbing into the lead vehicle, watched Shin laughing at something another operator said, watched the casual confidence of men who had already decided this mission would unfold exactly as they expected. It does not matter what they know, she said quietly. Only what I can do when it matters. Torres studied her for a long moment, then nodded slowly. The response seemed to satisfy something in him. Some question he had been carrying since he learned she would be attached to this operation. He had seen her work before, years ago in Helmand Province, had watched through a spotting scope as she made shots that other snipers said were impossible. He knew what the SEALs did not. I put something in a weapons cache, he said, his voice dropping lower. Barrett, M. 82. Contingency equipment. Figured you might want to know where it is. Vasquez's expression did not change, but something shifted behind her eyes. She gave a single nod of acknowledgement. The convoy commander's voice crackled over the radio, announcing 2 minutes to departure. Torres moved to take his position in the driver's seat, while Vasquez climbed into the vehicle's interior, settling onto the bench seat beside 2 combat medics and an Air Force tactical controller who would coordinate any air support the mission might require. None of them knew her beyond the brief introduction that had been made during the pre-mission checklist. Intelligence liaison, Marine Corps. The words meant nothing to them, suggested nothing beyond another body filling a required slot on the personnel manifest. Outside, Chun took his seat in the second assault vehicle, his mind already forward on the mission ahead. The compound clearance would be straightforward, a surgical extraction of a high-value target who had been tracked to this location over months of patient intelligence work. In out in under 20 minutes, if everything went according to plan. He did not spare another thought for the Marine Staff Sergeant riding in the trail vehicle. She had already been categorized and dismissed, filed away in a mental folder reserved for people who existed on the periphery of operations without contributing to their success. The convoy began to move, for vehicles snaking out of the staging area and onto the mountain road that would carry them toward the target compound. The route climbed steadily, switchbacks carved into terrain that had been ancient when the first empires rose and fell in these valleys. Dust billowed behind the vehicles in clouds that glowed briefly in the taillights before dispersing into darkness. In the trail vehicle, Vasquez watched the ridge lines through the armored window. The positions she had identified in the briefing were not visible from this angle, would not be visible until the convoy entered the valley where the target compound waited. But she knew they were there. She had spent 3 years learning to read this kind of terrain, learning to see what satellite imagery suggested but could not confirm. Torres caught her eye in the rearview mirror. She could see the question there, the same one he had asked outside. She answered it without words, her gaze returning to the mountains that rose around them like the walls of a trap waiting to be sprung. The SEALs in the lead vehicles talked quietly among themselves, running through contingencies and assignments with the practiced ease of men who had done this 100 times before. They did not discuss the intelligence briefing or the threat positions the Marine had identified. Those concerns had been dismissed along with the woman who raised them. The convoy climbed higher, the air growing thinner and colder as they ascended toward the valley that would change everything they thought they knew. The convoy wound through the final series of switchbacks as the sky began to lighten along the eastern horizon. Vasquez pressed closer to the armored window, her eyes tracing the ridgelines that rose on either side of the narrowing valley. The terrain was exactly as she had studied it, exactly as she had warned. There, Eastern Ridge, approximately 1,100 meters from the road, a slight discoloration in the rocks that most observers would dismiss as natural shadow variation. But Vasquez recognized the pattern. The particular way vegetation had been cleared to create firing lanes, the geometry of stone that had been subtly rearranged to provide cover while maintaining sight lines down into the valley. She shifted her attention to the southern ridge. Another position, this one slightly higher, maybe 1,200 meters out. The morning light caught something metallic for just a fraction of a second before it disappeared. Someone up there had moved, adjusted their position, perhaps checked a weapon. The western ridge showed the same indicators. 3 positions forming a triangle around the valley floor, each with overlapping fields of fire on the road below. It was textbook ambush geometry, the kind of setup that appeared in training manuals as an example of what to avoid driving into. Vasquez keyed her radio to the command frequency. Warhammer 6, this is Intel Actual. Recommend convoy halt at current position. I have visual indicators of occupied positions on all 3 ridgelines, matching my earlier assessment. Suggest dismounted approach to avoid potential kill zone. Static filled her earpiece for a moment before Webb's voice responded. His tone carried the patience of a man addressing an interruption he had already decided to ignore. Intel Actual, Warhammer 6. Negative on the halt. Predator shows the route clear, and we are on timeline. Continue current movement. The Predator drone orbiting somewhere overhead could see heat signatures and movement, but it could not see what Vasquez was seeing. It could not interpret the micro-terrain indicators that revealed prepared fighting positions. It could not recognize the work of someone who understood concealment at a professional level. She tried again. Warhammer 6, I have direct visual on position indicators. Recommend caution on approach. Chen's voice cut into the frequency before Webb could respond. Intel Actual, this is Warhammer 2. Maybe leave the tactical calls to the people who actually operate outside the wire. We have been running this AO for 8 months without your help. Laughter crackled through the radio from one of the other vehicles. Someone keyed their mic just to add a snorting sound of derision before releasing it. In the trail vehicle, Torres glanced at Vasquez through the rearview mirror. His hands tightened on the steering wheel, knuckles whitening beneath the tactical gloves. He had heard her assessments dismissed before, years ago, by men who later wished they had listened. Vasquez watched the lead vehicles enter the narrow valley between the ridgelines. From her position, she could see exactly how the terrain channelized the road, forcing the convoy into a corridor with no room to maneuver. The rock walls rose steeply on either side, too steep for the armored vehicles to climb even if they needed to escape. The valley stretched ahead for perhaps 800 meters before opening into the wider basin where the target compound sat. 800 meters of road with nowhere to go but forward or back, overlooked by 3 elevated positions that commanded every inch of the passage below. She recognized what she was seeing because she had created positions like these herself. She understood the geometry because she had exploited it from the other end of a rifle scope. The people on those ridges had chosen their ground with professional competence, had prepared their positions with patience and skill, had waited for exactly this moment when a convoy of vehicles would drive directly into their engagement zone. Vasquez turned to Torres. When it starts, get us behind that rock formation. She pointed to a massive boulder outcropping visible perhaps 200 meters behind their current position. It was the only viable cover within immediate reach. Torres nodded without asking for clarification. He understood what she was not saying, what she could not say over a radio frequency monitored by men who had already decided her input was worthless. She checked her watch. The lead vehicle was now fully inside the valley, the second vehicle following close behind. In approximately 90 seconds, the entire convoy would be within the kill zone. The combat medic sitting across from her looked up from his equipment check. Something wrong? Vasquez considered the question. There were many answers she could give, none of which would change what was about to happen. Prepare for casualties, she said simply. The medic's expression shifted from curiosity to confusion to something approaching alarm. He opened his mouth to ask a follow-up question, but the words never came. The sound reached them first, a rushing whisper that Vasquez recognized instantly. She was already shouting for Torres to reverse when the lead vehicle's engine block erupted in a ball of orange flame and black smoke. The RPG's impact lifting the front of the armored truck off the ground before slamming it back down sideways across the road. Then the ridgelines came alive with muzzle flashes, and a valley filled with the overlapping thunder of automatic weapons fire pouring down from 3 directions at once. Torres slammed the MRAP into reverse, the vehicle lurching backward as rounds began sparking off the armored plating. Vasquez braced herself against the seat, her eyes already calculating ranges and angles, her mind already running through the Barrett specifications and the geometry of what would be required to change the equation that was currently killing men in the vehicles ahead. The radio exploded with shouting voices, fragmented calls for support, someone screaming about Reyes being hit. Through it all, Webb's voice cut through with the desperate clarity of a man watching his command disintegrate. Contact front, contact left, contact right. We are pinned. Require immediate support. Vasquez reached for her radio. She would answer that call, but not in the way anyone expected. The world inside the lead vehicle had become a chaos of smoke and screaming metal. Webb felt the impact before he understood it. the RPG striking the engine block with enough force to lift the entire front end of the armored truck and slam it sideways across the narrow road. His restraints caught him hard across the chest, driving the air from his lungs as the vehicle came to rest at an angle that blocked any forward movement for the vehicles behind. Then the gunfire began. Rounds hammered against the armored plating from 3 directions simultaneously, the sound like 1,000 hammers striking in overlapping rhythm. Webb's training took over before his conscious mind could catch up, his hands already releasing the restraints, his body already moving toward the door. "Dismount," he shouted into the chaos. "Dismount and return fire." He hit the ground rolling, the packed earth of the road offering no cover as tracer rounds streaked overhead from the eastern ridge. The angle was wrong, impossibly wrong. The shooters were above them, looking down into what had become a killing floor, and his team was caught in the open with nowhere to go. Reyes was the first one hit. The petty officer had barely cleared the vehicle when a round caught him through the shoulder, spinning him back against the armored door. He slumped down the side of the truck, blood already spreading across his tactical vest as he tried to crawl toward cover that did not exist. Webb grabbed Reyes by the drag handle on his vest and hauled him behind the disabled vehicle's engine block, the only solid cover within reach. Rounds continued to punch into the road around them, kicking up geysers of dirt and stone fragments. Behind him, the second vehicle had stopped short of the kill zone center, its occupants spilling out to seek cover behind the wheels and body panels. But the fire was coming from above, negating most of the protection the armored vehicles could provide. Men pressed themselves flat against the ground while bullets cracked through the air inches above their heads. Webb keyed his radio with one hand while applying pressure to Reyes's wound with the other. "Contact front, contact left, contact right. We are pinned. Require immediate support." His own voice sounded strange in his ears, too calm for the situation, the professional detachment of training overlaying the cold fear that was beginning to spread through his chest. He had been in firefights before, dozens of them across years of deployments. But he had never been caught this completely, never felt the geometry of a battle turn so decisively against him in the opening seconds. The positions on the ridgelines were exactly where the intelligence officer had said they would be. The thought arrived with sickening clarity as another burst of fire stitched across the road beside him. She had seen this, had tried to warn him, and he had dismissed her assessment as the nervous imaginings of someone who did not understand real operations. Chen's voice came over the radio, strained with effort. "6, I cannot get an angle on them. They are too high and too far. My rifle will not reach." Webb looked up at the eastern ridge, trying to estimate the range. 1,100 meters, maybe more, at a steep upward angle. The SEALs carried weapons optimized for close-quarters combat and room clearing, not long-range precision fire. They had expected to fight inside a compound, not across a valley against elevated positions. Another burst of fire raked the disabled vehicle, and Webb heard someone cry out from the second truck. The calls for medic began overlapping on radio, too many voices reporting wounds, reporting positions that offered no protection. He tried to raise the Tactical Operations Center for fire support, but the mountains blocked their satellite communications. The radio produced only static where there should have been the reassuring voice of the operations officer coordinating assets. They were alone, cut off, and being systematically destroyed by an enemy they could not effectively engage. Movement on the eastern ridge caught his eye. A fighter was setting up something large on a tripod, the silhouette unmistakable even at this distance. A heavy machine gun, probably a DSHK or similar. Once that weapon came online, the armored vehicles would offer no protection at all. The heavy rounds would punch through the plating like paper. Webb felt time compressing, the seconds stretching as he calculated how long his team had before that gun began firing. 2 minutes, maybe less. 2 minutes until the cover they were hiding behind became a death trap. "Warhammer 6, this is Trail Actual." The voice on the radio was Torres, the Marine gunnery sergeant from the support vehicle. "We have reached cover position. What is your status?" Webb looked back down the road toward where the trail vehicle had been. He could not see it. which meant Torres had managed to reverse out of the immediate kill zone. Small mercy. We are pinned, Webb replied. Multiple wounded. Enemy has the high ground on 3 sides. Cannot effectively return fire. They're setting up a heavy gun on the eastern ridge. A pause on the radio. Then a different voice came through, one Webb did not immediately recognize. Female, calm, carrying none of the desperation that colored every other transmission. Warhammer 6, this is Frost. Keep your men down and mark that heavy gun position. I am engaging. Webb stared at his radio. Frost. The call sign meant nothing to him. Who the hell is Frost? He demanded. The response came from Torres, not the unknown voice. Senior Chief, that is your intelligence liaison, and I suggest you do exactly what she says. Chun pressed his body against the wheel well of the second vehicle, making himself as small as possible while rounds cracked through the air above him. The fire was relentless, disciplined bursts from multiple positions that kept every operator pinned in place. Anyone who tried to move caught immediate attention from at least 2 directions. He had attempted to return fire twice. Both times his rounds had fallen short or impacted uselessly against the rocks far below the enemy positions. His rifle was not designed for this kind of engagement, could not reach targets at 1,100 meters elevation when he was shooting nearly straight up. The geometry was impossible. Warhammer 2, this is 6. Webb's voice came through tight, with controlled urgency. Status on your element. Chun looked around at the men clustered behind the vehicle. Kowalski had taken fragments in his leg from a ricochet and was applying his own tourniquet. Martinez was trying to provide suppressive fire, but succeeding only in wasting ammunition on shots that would never connect. The others were simply trying to survive, bodies pressed flat, waiting for something to change. 2 walking wounded, Chun reported. Pinned in place. Cannot effectively engage. What is the play, Senior Chief? The pause before Webb's response told Chun everything he needed to know about their tactical options. There was no play. They were caught in a kill zone with no fire support, no way to maneuver, and an enemy that held every advantage terrain could provide. Hold position, Webb finally said. We have someone engaging from the rear element. Chun wanted to ask who could possibly engage from the rear element. The support vehicle carried medics and a tactical controller, not shooters. The only other person back there was the Marine intelligence officer, and she was about as likely to solve this problem as she was to sprout wings and fly them out. The heavy machine gun on the eastern ridge was nearly assembled now. Chun could see the crew working with practiced efficiency, the weapon's long barrel glinting in the early morning light. Once it began firing, their armored vehicles would become coffins. The heavy rounds would punch through the plating, through the bodies inside, through anything that tried to hide behind them. He estimated they had perhaps 60 seconds before that happened. Movement on the southern ridge drew his attention. At least 8 fighters occupied that position, their fire coordinated and relentless. The western ridge held even more, maybe 12 shooters laying down suppressive bursts that kept any response contained. Whoever had planned this ambush had done so with professional competence, positioning their forces to create overlapping fields of fire that left no safe ground anywhere in the valley below. Chun thought about the intelligence briefing, about the Marine Staff Sergeant pointing to those exact positions on the satellite imagery. He thought about Webb dismissing her assessment, about his own comment regarding PowerPoint Rangers. The memory tasted like ash in his mouth. Something has to change, Martinez shouted over the gunfire. We cannot just sit here. Chun knew he was right. But knowing and doing were different things when every possible action led directly into concentrated enemy fire. They were trapped by terrain and geometry, by an enemy that had chosen their ground perfectly and waited with patience for this exact moment. The radio crackled with Torres's voice. All Warhammer elements, keep heads down. Frost is engaging in 5 seconds. Chun did not know what that meant, did not understand who Frost was or how anyone from the rear element could possibly affect what was happening on those ridgelines. But he had been in enough firefights to recognize the tone in Torres's voice. It was the sound of absolute confidence, the kind that only came from having seen something work before. He pressed himself lower behind the wheel well and waited. The sound that followed was unlike anything else on the battlefield. A deep, thunderous report that echoed off the valley walls, distinctly different from the sharp crack of the AK fire raining down from above. Chen recognized it immediately, had heard it on ranges and in training exercises, though never in actual combat. A Barrett M82, 50 caliber. Someone was shooting a 50 caliber rifle. He looked up toward the eastern ridge, toward the heavy machine gun position that had been seconds away from ending their lives. The fighter who had been mounting the weapon was simply gone from the chest up, his body crumpling backward as the heavy gun tumbled down the rock face, clattering uselessly into the valley below. For a moment, the enemy fire actually paused. The fighters on the ridgelines had just watched one of their own evaporate from a shot that came from nowhere they could identify. Chen stared at the empty position where a man had stood seconds before. The shot had come from behind them, from the direction of the rear element, at a range that exceeded anything he would have thought possible at that angle. Webb's voice came over the radio, carrying a confusion that matched Chen's own. "Frost, confirm. Was that you?" The response came in a voice Chen now recognized, the same calm female tone from the intelligence briefing, the same woman he had mocked as a PowerPoint ranger. "Target down. Shifting to southern ridge." Another thunderous report rolled across the valley, and on the southern ridge, a fighter dropped. Chen realized he had stopped breathing. Vasquez had moved the moment Torres brought the MRAP to a stop behind the massive boulder formation. While the combat medics were still bracing themselves against the sudden halt, she was already out the rear hatch. The Barrett M82 pulled from the weapon's cache and balanced across her shoulder. The rock formation rose approximately 40 meters above the road, a jagged spine of ancient stone that had been pushed up from the valley floor by geological forces millennia ago. She had identified it during her terrain analysis as the only viable elevated position within reach of the kill zone. Now she climbed with the rifle's weight pulling at her shoulders, her boots finding purchase on surfaces that would have seemed impossible to anyone watching. Torres had offered to help carry ammunition. She had taken the bandolier of 50 caliber rounds and told him to monitor the radio. There was no time for anything else. The climb took 90 seconds, each one measured against the gunfire echoing from the valley ahead. She could hear the distinctive rhythm of the ambush, the overlapping fields of fire that told her exactly how the enemy had positioned themselves. She could hear the desperate radio calls from the SEALs pinned in the kill zone, the reports of wounded, the rising edge of panic in voices that had been confident hours earlier. She reached a natural shelf near the top of the formation and dropped into a prone position, the Barrett's bipod extending to rest on the rock surface. The scope came up to her eye with practiced fluidity, the valley spreading out below her in crystal clarity. Range to the eastern ridge, 1,180 meters. Angle, 14 degrees upslope. Wind, crossing left to right at approximately 8 knots, channeled by the valley walls. She processed the variables automatically, her mind performing calculations that had become as natural as breathing over years of training and deployment. The heavy machine gun position resolved in her scope. A fighter was mounting the weapon, his movements hurried but competent. In perhaps 30 seconds, that gun would begin firing, and the SEALs in the valley below would start dying in numbers that would make the current casualties seem minor. She keyed her radio. "Warhammer 6, this is Frost. Keep your men down and mark that heavy gun position. I am engaging." The response from Webb carried confusion, but she was already past caring about his understanding. Her finger found the trigger, her breathing slowed to the rhythm she had learned in countless hours of practice, and the world narrowed to the space between her eye and the target. The Barrett spoke. The recoil pushed against her shoulder, familiar and controlled. Through the scope, she watched the round travel, a journey of nearly 2 seconds across the valley. The fighter at the machine gun position simply ceased to exist from the chest up, the heavy weapon tumbling away down the rock face. She was already shifting before the echo faded. Southern ridge. Range, 1,340 meters. For fighters visible in a prepared position, one manning a PCAM machine gun that was pouring fire into the valley below. The angle was steeper here, the wind slightly different. She adjusted without conscious thought. Second shot. The PCAM gunner dropped, his weapon falling silent. The other 3 fighters scattered, breaking for cover. But Vasquez had already tracked their movement, already anticipated where they would go. These were not amateurs hiding behind random rocks. They were trained fighters moving to secondary positions, which meant their routes were predictable. Third shot caught a fighter mid-sprint, his body tumbling down the scree slope in a cascade of loose stone. Fourth shot took another as he dove behind a boulder, the round arriving before he completed the motion. The fifth fighter had reached cover, disappearing behind a rock formation that blocked her angle. She marked his position mentally and shifted her attention to the western ridge. Warhammer 6, this is Frost. Southern ridge neutralized. Shifting to western position. Webb's voice came back, and something had changed in his tone. The confusion had been replaced by something else, something that sounded almost like awe. Frost, Warhammer 6. Copy all. We have eyes on western ridge, count 12 shooters, maybe more. Vasquez found the position in her scope. The western ridge was the largest concentration. The fighters spread across multiple prepared positions that covered the entire valley floor. They had watched 2 of their supporting elements get systematically destroyed and were now adjusting, trying to identify where the fire was coming from. One of them pointed in her direction, had perhaps spotted the muzzle flash from her previous shots. She put a round through his chest before he could communicate the information to the others. 11 remaining. The Barrett's magazine held 10 rounds. She had expended 6. The bandolier across her chest held 40 more, but reloading took time, and the fighters on the western ridge were beginning to understand they were being hunted. She fired again. 10 remaining. A fighter tried to reposition the PCAM from the southern ridge's fallen gunner. She dropped it before he could reach it. 9 remaining. 2 more shots in quick succession, both finding targets that had exposed themselves for just a moment too long. 7 remaining. The magazine ran dry. Her hands moved with mechanical precision, ejecting the empty and seating a fresh one in a motion that took less than 3 seconds. The fighters on the western ridge had stopped shooting at the valley below. They were searching for her now, their fire redirected toward the rock formation where she had taken position. Rounds began impacting the stone around her, close enough to send chips of rock stinging against her cheek. They had found her. She shifted position, moving 3 meters to the left where a different angle of stone provided fresh cover. Her scope found a fighter who had spotted her. 6 remaining. The western ridge was beginning to understand that they were no longer the hunters. Chen watched the western ridge through his optic, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. Fighters who had been pouring disciplined fire into the kill zone moments ago were now scrambling for cover, their attention redirected towards something behind the seal position. Muzzle flashes sparked from their weapons, but the rounds were not coming toward the valley floor. They were shooting at something else entirely. Another thunderous report echoed across the mountains, and a fighter who had been running between positions dropped mid-stride. "That is 11, someone said over the radio. Chen did not recognize the voice immediately, then realized it was one of the combat medics from the trail vehicle, counting shots like a spectator at a sporting event. The SEALs in the kill zone had stopped taking fire. The enemy's attention had shifted completely to the threat that was systematically dismantling their ambush from an unexpected direction. Chen raised his head slightly, enough to get a better view of what was happening on the ridgelines. The western ridge was in chaos. Fighters ran from position to position, trying to find cover from a shooter they could not effectively engage. Their weapons were designed for the ranges they had planned, the distances to the valley floor where their targets were supposed to be trapped. They had not prepared for someone shooting back from beyond their effective range, from an angle they had not anticipated. The Barrett spoke again, the sound rolling through the valley like distant thunder. Another fighter fell. Chen found himself counting the bodies. The eastern ridge position was empty, the heavy machine gun lying somewhere on the rocks below. The southern ridge showed 4 motionless forms scattered across the prepared fighting position. The western ridge was losing men with every shot, the the survivors increasingly desperate in their attempts to escape. "Who the hell is she?" Martinez asked from beside him. His voice carried the same disbelief Chen felt. "The intelligence liaison," Chen replied. The words felt strange in his mouth, inadequate to describe what he was witnessing. "She is the intelligence liaison." Another shot. Another fighter down. Webb's voice came over the radio, steadier now that the immediate pressure had lifted. "All Warhammer elements, prepare to move on my command. We are extracting to the rear element's position." Chen acknowledged the order, but kept watching the western ridge. The remaining fighters had realized they could not win this engagement, could not even effectively participate in it. Their ambush had been turned inside out by a single shooter operating at ranges that made their own weapons useless. One of them broke and ran, abandoning his position entirely and sprinting down the backside of the ridge toward whatever extraction route they had planned. Others followed, the disciplined force that had sprung the ambush dissolving into a scattered retreat. The Barrett fired twice more in rapid succession, catching two of the fleeing fighters before they could disappear behind the ridge crest. The others kept running, no longer interested in the fight they had started. "Western ridge breaking," Chen reported. "Enemy is retreating." "Warhammer 6 copies," Webb responded. "All elements move now. Bound to the rear in pairs." "Frost, can you cover a movement?" The response came immediately, that same calm female voice that had announced the engagement. "Affirmative, Warhammer 6. I have Overwatch. Move when ready." Chen grabbed Kowalski's vest and hauled the wounded operator to his feet. The leg wound was bad, but manageable, the tourniquet doing its job. They moved together toward the rear of the convoy, using the disabled vehicles as cover while Vasquez maintained watch on the ridgelines above. The Barrett spoke once more, and Chen looked up to see a fighter who had been trying to re-establish a firing position tumble backward out of sight. She was covering their movement with precision fire at ranges exceeding 1,000 meters, placing shots close enough to eliminate threats, but never endangering the SEALs moving below. It was shooting of a caliber Chen had only seen from the most elite military snipers in the world, the kind of performance that earned spots on specialized teams and classified missions. They reached the boulder formation where the trail vehicle was sheltered. Torres stood beside the MRAP, directing the wounded toward the medics who had established a casualty collection point. His expression carried no surprise at what was happening, only the focused efficiency of a man who had expected exactly this outcome. Chen looked up at the rock formation rising above them. Somewhere up there, the woman he had dismissed as a PowerPoint ranger was single-handedly destroying an enemy force that had nearly killed his entire team. "Where did she come from?" he asked Torres. The gunnery sergeant followed his gaze upward. "Helmand Province, mostly. Before that, Scout Sniper School at Quantico. She held the instructor record for longest confirmed hit until she broke it herself on deployment." Chen processed the information. Scout Sniper. Not intelligence liaison. Not a staff creature who had never left the wire. A trained Marine Corps sniper who had apparently been assigned to their mission without anyone bothering to mention her actual capabilities. Another shot rang out. On the western ridge, the last visible fighter dropped. Torres checked his watch. 12 minutes since first contact. 17 confirmed kills. "We're going to need more body bags than we brought." Chen had no response to that. He simply stood and watched the ridge lines, waiting for the woman called Frost to descend from her position and wondering how he was ever going to look her in the eye after what he had said in that briefing room. Vasquez maintained her position on the rock shelf, scope sweeping methodically across the three ridge lines. The immediate threat had been neutralized, but she knew better than to assume the fight was over. Ambushes of this sophistication rarely involved only the fighters visible in the initial engagement. There would be reserves somewhere, a quick reaction force waiting to exploit success or cover a withdrawal. She found them 2 minutes later. Movement on the eastern ridge, approximately 400 meters behind the original position. A group of fighters was working their way along the ridge line, probably responding to radio calls from their dying comrades. She counted 8 of them moving in a tactical column, weapons ready, clearly trained in basic infantry movement techniques. Warhammer 6, this is Frost. I have 8 additional fighters approaching from the east, 400 meters behind the original ambush position. They're moving toward your extraction route. Webb's response came immediately. Can you engage? The range was 1,400 meters, the angle complicated by the intervening terrain. The fighters were moving, not stationary, which added another layer of difficulty. But they had not yet identified her position, which gave her the advantage of first shot. Affirmative. Engaging now. She settled her breathing and found the lead fighter in her scope. He was moving at a walking pace, weapon held at the ready, head turning to scan the terrain ahead. In approximately 90 seconds, his group would reach a position that overlooked the boulder formation where the SEALs were consolidating. The Barrett spoke. The lead fighter dropped. The column immediately scattered, fighters diving for cover behind rocks and into depressions in the terrain. But scattering only worked if you knew where the fire was coming from. They did not. Vasquez tracked a fighter who had taken cover behind a boulder too small to fully conceal him. His shoulder and part of his torso remained visible from her angle. She placed the round through his exposed rib cage and shifted to the next target before his body finished falling. A third fighter tried to low-crawl toward better cover. The movement was slow and deliberate, the kind of tactical patience that might have worked against a lesser shooter. Vasquez waited until he paused to assess his route, then sent a round through the top of his skull. The remaining 5 fighters had gone to ground completely, pressing themselves into whatever concealment they could find. They were no longer trying to advance toward the SEAL position. They were trying to survive. She could wait them out. Eventually they would have to move, would expose themselves for just long enough to provide a shot opportunity. But waiting meant the SEALs remained static, meant the enemy had time to coordinate additional reinforcements, meant the tactical situation could deteriorate again. Vasquez made a decision. Warhammer 6, this is Frost. 5 remaining fighters are pinned on the eastern ridge. I am repositioning to gain angle. Recommend you continue extraction while I maintain pressure. Copy, Frost. We are moving to secondary extraction point. Link up when able. She gathered the Barrett and began moving along the rock formation, working her way toward a secondary position she had identified during her initial scan. The new angle would expose the concealed fighters, would give her shots they thought they were protected from. The movement took 45 seconds, each step chosen carefully to avoid silhouetting herself against the skyline. She dropped into the new position and brought the scope up, finding the eastern ridge from a perspective shifted nearly 30 degrees from her original location. The fighters who had been concealed were now partially exposed. One of them had his back pressed against a rock that provided excellent cover from her first position, but left his entire left side visible from here. She fired. For remaining. The others reacted to the shot, tried to adjust their positions. But adjusting meant moving, and moving meant exposure. 3 more shots over the next 20 seconds. The eastern ridge fell silent. Vasquez scanned the remaining terrain, looking for any additional movement. The original ambush positions remained empty, the bodies of the fighters she had killed earlier still visible where they had fallen. The reinforcement group was eliminated. No additional movement appeared on any of the ridgelines. She keyed her radio. All ridgelines clear. 17 plus 8, 25 total. No additional movement observed. Webb's voice came back, and the awe had returned. Copy all, Frost. Extraction route is clear. We have vehicles inbound from the FOB, ETA 15 minutes. Can you maintain overwatch until extract? Affirmative. I will hold position until relieved. She settled back into a stable shooting platform, the Barrett's barrel oriented toward the most likely avenue of approach for any additional enemy forces. The valley below had gone quiet, the echoes of gunfire fading into the mountain silence. Somewhere in the distance, a bird called out, reclaiming the morning air that had been filled with violence minutes before. 25 fighters, 12 minutes of active engagement, plus another 4 for the reinforcement element. Ranges from 1,100 to 1,600 meters, angles varying from 12 to 18 degrees, wind conditions shifting throughout. It was not her longest engagement in terms of range. It was not even her highest body count from a single operation. But it was the first time she had conducted a solo counter-ambush against a numerically superior force occupying prepared positions at elevation. She allowed herself a small moment of professional satisfaction before returning her full attention to the scope. The extraction was not complete. The mission was not over. And somewhere on those ridgelines, there might be one more fighter waiting for her attention to waver. It would not. Webb stood beside the disabled lead vehicle, surveying the kill zone that had nearly become his team's grave. The morning sun had risen fully now, casting long shadows across the valley floor and illuminating the destruction that had unfolded over the past 20 minutes. Reyes was stable, the medics having controlled his bleeding and started fluids. Kowalski's leg wound would require surgery but was not life-threatening. 3 other operators had minor injuries, fragment wounds, and lacerations from ricochets, nothing that would keep them out of action for long. It could have been so much worse. He looked up at the ridgelines, at the positions that had poured fire down on his team with such devastating precision. The enemy had chosen their ground perfectly, had waited with patience for the convoy to enter the kill zone, had sprung the ambush with professional coordination, and his team had driven directly into it, because he had dismissed the warnings of someone he had decided was not worth listening to. The intelligence liaison had identified every one of those positions. She had recommended halting the convoy, had suggested a dismounted approach that would have avoided the kill zone entirely. And he had cut her off mid-sentence, had told her to leave tactical decisions to the operators. Senior Chief Torres approached from the direction of the boulder formation. Extraction vehicles are 5 minutes out. Frost is descending from her overwatch position. Webb nodded, his eyes still on the ridgelines. How long have you known her? Torres considered the question. For years. First met her in Helmand, when she was attached to a Marine infantry battalion as sniper support. Watched her make a shot at 2,800 meters that 3 other snipers said was impossible. 2,800 meters. Webb processed the number. That was nearly 2 miles, a distance at which bullet drop and wind drift made precision shooting more art than science. The shots she had made today, while extraordinary, were apparently well within her demonstrated capabilities. Why was she assigned to us as intelligence liaison? Because that is what JSOC requested. Torres shrugged. They needed someone who could read terrain and identify threat positions that drone surveillance misses. She is the best terrain analyst in the Marine Corps because she has spent years figuring out where she would set up to kill people. Takes a sniper to find a sniper. The logic was elegant in its simplicity. They had not been assigned an intelligence analyst who happened to know about terrain. They had been assigned an elite sniper whose expertise made her the perfect person to identify exactly the kind of ambush positions that had nearly killed them. And no one told us, Webb said. Torres met his eyes. She told you. In the briefing. She pointed at those exact positions and explained why she assessed them as threats. You chose not to listen. The words landed with the weight of an accusation, though Torres delivered them without apparent judgment. He was simply stating facts, the kind of facts that would appear in after-action reports and possibly in career-ending reviews. Webb had no defense to offer. He had dismissed her because she did not fit his expectations, had categorized her as a staff creature based on her assignment rather than her capabilities, had allowed his assumptions to override the professional assessment of someone who clearly knew what she was talking about. Movement on the rock formation drew his attention. A figure was descending the steep face, the Barrett rifle slung across her back, moving with the sure-footed confidence of someone who had climbed terrain like this many times before. Vasquez reached the base of the formation and walked toward the group of SEALs gathered near the vehicles. Her expression neutral, her bearing professional. Chin stepped forward as she approached. His face carried something Webb had rarely seen from the petty officer, genuine humility. Staff Sergeant, Chin began, then stopped. He seemed to be searching for words adequate to the situation. What you did up there? I have never seen anything like it. Vasquez looked at him for a long moment. The silence stretched until Chin shifted uncomfortably. 25 confirmed, she said finally. The reinforcement element was trying to flank your extraction route. They would have reached Overwatch position in approximately 90 seconds if I had not engaged. She nodded slowly. I understand. He paused again, and when he spoke next, his voice was quieter. I also understand that I owe you an apology. What I said in the briefing room was out of line. I judged you without knowing anything about you, and it almost got people killed. Vasquez studied him with an expression Webb could not quite read. Then she gave a single, short nod. We all make assumptions, she said. The difference is what we do when those assumptions are proven wrong. She walked past him toward the casualty collection point, kneeling beside Reyes to check his bandages with the practiced efficiency of someone who had treated field wounds before. The wounded SEAL looked up at her, confusion evident on his pale face. You're the intel officer, he said. His voice was weak but coherent. Vasquez adjusted the pressure dressing on his shoulder. I am, she confirmed. I am also other things. Reyes managed a small laugh that turned into a cough. Other things? Yeah, I heard. He closed his eyes. Thanks for not letting us die out there. She patted his uninjured shoulder and stood, moving on to check the other wounded without responding to his gratitude. Webb watched her work, recognizing the quiet competence of someone who did not require acknowledgement to do what needed to be done. The extraction vehicles appeared on the road below, a convoy of fresh MRAPs rolling toward their position. The mission had failed in its primary objective. The high-value target certainly evacuated during the firefight, but the team was alive. That was something. That was everything. Webb approached Vasquez as she finished her assessment of the wounded. He was not sure what he intended to say, was not sure any words could bridge the gap between what he had assumed and what she had proven. She looked up at him and waited. Webb stood before her, and for the first time in his career, he found himself without the words that leadership usually provided. He had commanded men through firefights and ambushes, had delivered notifications to families of fallen operators, had stood before admirals and generals to brief operations that would never appear in any official record. None of those moments had prepared him for this one. Staff Sergeant Vasquez, he began, then stopped. The formal address felt inadequate, almost insulting given what she had done. He started again. I owe you more than an apology. I owe you the lives of my men. Vasquez regarded him with the same neutral expression she had worn throughout the morning. You owe me nothing, Senior Chief. I did my job. Your job. Webb shook his head slowly. Your job was intelligence liaison, briefing support, terrain analysis. What you did up there was something else entirely. She was quiet for a moment, her eyes moving past him to the ridgelines where 25 fighters had died under her rifle. When she spoke, her voice carried a weight that Webb had not heard before. When I was 19, I watched an ambush kill 7 Marines because their convoy commander dismissed the threat assessment from a lance corporal who had noticed disturbed earth near the road. She paused, the memory clearly still present despite the years. The lance corporal was right. There was an IED, and 7 families received folded flags because someone decided that rank and experience mattered more than accurate information. Webb felt the words settle into him, understanding now why she had not argued when he dismissed her in the briefing room. She had seen what happened when warnings went unheeded. She had learned that some lessons only landed after they drew blood. I became a sniper because I wanted to be the one providing Overwatch, she continued. I wanted to be the person who could change the outcome when everything went wrong. And I studied terrain analysis because I never wanted to miss what that lance corporal saw. I never wanted to be the one who could not read the ground. The extraction vehicles had reached their position, fresh operators spilling out to assist with the wounded and secure the area. The immediate crisis had passed, replaced by the controlled chaos of casualty evacuation and scene documentation. But Webb remained fixed in place, listening to a woman he had thoroughly misjudged explain the experiences that had shaped her. JSOC did not send me as punishment or as a test, Vasquez said. They sent me because I am the best person they have for identifying prepared ambush positions. That is not arrogance. It is simply what my record demonstrates. Webb nodded slowly. He had seen enough of that record now to know she was stating fact, not boasting. The shots she had made, the tactical decisions she had executed under pressure, the calm professionalism she had maintained throughout. These were not the products of luck or circumstance. They were the results of years of dedicated training and operational experience. "Why did you not say something?" he asked. "In the briefing, when I cut you off." When Chen made his comments. "You could have pulled rank, demanded respect, explained who you were." Vasquez met his eyes directly. "Because respect demanded is not respect earned. And because I learned a long time ago that words rarely change minds that are already closed. Actions do." She gestured toward the ridge lines. "Those men up there had prepared an ambush that should have killed your entire team. They had superior numbers, superior positions, and complete tactical surprise. The only reason your men are loading onto those vehicles instead of into body bags is because I was here and I was ready." She paused, letting the statement settle. "That is the argument I chose to make. Not in the briefing room, where it would have been dismissed. Here, where it could not be ignored." Webb absorbed her words, recognizing the tactical thinking that extended beyond rifles and terrain into the realm of human psychology. She had known that nothing she said would have changed his mind before the ambush. So she had waited, had positioned herself to act when action became necessary, had let her performance speak the only language that arrogant men like him could understand. He had underestimated her in every possible way, and she had known he would. The realization should have stung his pride. Instead, it sparked something closer to admiration. She had read him as accurately as she had read the terrain, had anticipated his dismissal and planned accordingly, had never lost sight of the mission even when those around her refused to acknowledge her value. "I will be including a full account of your actions in my after-action report," he said. "Accurate account, not the sanitized version that protects egos." Vasquez shrugged slightly. "Write what you witnessed, Senior Chief. That is all any report should contain." A medic called out that the wounded were loaded and ready for transport. The moment of conversation had reached its natural end, the demands of the operation reasserting themselves over personal reckonings. But Webb was not quite finished. "I would be honored to operate with you again," he said. The words felt formal, almost ceremonial, but he meant every one of them. "If you would be willing." Vasquez looked at him for a long moment, something shifting in her expression that might have been the ghost of a smile. "Ask me again after you read the full debrief," she said. "You might change your mind when you learn what I did not tell you about my last 3 deployments." She turned and walked toward the extraction vehicles, leaving Webb standing in the kill zone with the uncomfortable certainty that whatever he thought he knew about Staff Sergeant Elena Vasquez, the truth was probably far more complicated. The extraction helicopters touched down at Forward Operating Base Chapman as the morning sun climbed toward its midday position. Chen helped guide Reyes' stretcher toward the waiting medical team, the wounded SEAL conscious but pale from blood loss. The shoulder wound would require surgical intervention at Bagram, but the medics had stabilized him well enough that the prognosis was good. Kowalski limped off the bird under his own power, refusing assistance despite the bandaged leg that would keep him off operations for at least 2 months. The other wounded followed, a procession of men who had come far closer to death than any of them cared to acknowledge. Chun watched Vasquez step off the last helicopter, the Barrett still slung across her back. She had maintained overwatch until the final extraction bird lifted off, had been the last friendly element to leave the kill zone. Even now, her eyes moved across the FOB with the automatic scanning pattern of someone who never fully relaxed in a combat environment. Torres met her on the landing pad, taking the Barrett from her shoulder with the familiarity of long acquaintance. She led him, rolling her shoulders to work out the tension of carrying the heavy rifle for the past 3 hours. 25 confirmed, Torres said. That is going to make some waves. Vasquez shook her head slightly. It was a target-rich environment against an enemy that did not expect return fire. The ranges were within standard parameters. Nothing exceptional. Chun approached, overhearing the exchange. He found himself marveling at her assessment. Nothing exceptional. She had single-handedly destroyed a prepared ambush force at ranges exceeding 1,000 meters, had saved an entire SEAL platoon from annihilation, and she was describing it as routine. "Staff Sergeant," he said. She turned to face him, her expression neutral. "I wanted to say something more than what I said back there." Vasquez waited, offering neither encouragement nor dismissal. Chen struggled to find the right words. He had spent years in special operations, had worked with the best shooters and tacticians the military produced. He had developed a sense for competence, an ability to recognize excellence when he encountered it. What he had witnessed today exceeded anything in his experience. "I have been doing this for 12 years, he said finally. 12 years of deployments, of firefights, of working with people who are supposed to be the best in the world. And I have never seen anyone do what you did today." He paused, making sure she understood he was not simply offering empty praise. "You did not just save our lives. You dominated that entire engagement from a position we did not even know existed, against an enemy that had every advantage. You turned their ambush into their annihilation. That is not routine. That is something else entirely." Vasquez studied him for a long moment. When she spoke, her voice was quieter than before. "I appreciate that, Petty Officer Chen. But what I did today was exactly what I was trained to do. The enemy made mistakes. They assumed their elevation and numbers would protect them. They did not account for the possibility of a shooter operating at ranges beyond their effective engagement distance." She glanced toward the ridgelines visible in the distance, toward the valley where the ambush had unfolded. "Every engagement I have ever fought has been determined by preparation and positioning. The person who reads the terrain better, who anticipates the enemy's assumptions, who places themselves where they can be most effective, that person wins. Today, that was me. Tomorrow, it might be someone else." Chen nodded slowly, recognizing the humility beneath her professional assessment. She was not dismissing her own achievement. She was contextualizing it within a framework of training and experience that had prepared her for exactly this situation. Webb joined them, his expression carrying the weight of the after-action responsibilities that awaited. The debrief would be extensive, the documentation thorough. What had happened in that valley would be analyzed and studied, would become training material for future operations. "Staff Sergeant," Webb said, "I have already contacted JSOC to request your continued attachment to our operations. They are expediting the paperwork." Vasquez raised an eyebrow. "That was fast." Webb allowed himself a small smile. "I may have emphasized the operational necessity, and the fact that we would probably all be dead without you." The extraction helicopters were powering down, their rotors slowing to a stop as ground crews moved in to begin post-flight procedures. The FOB was returning to its normal rhythm, the crisis of the morning already becoming history that would be recorded in reports and databases. Chen extended his hand. It was a gesture he rarely offered, reserved for those he genuinely respected. Vasquez looked at the offered hand for a moment, then accepted it. "Welcome to the team," Chen said, "even if you were already here and we were too blind to see it." Vasquez shook his hand with a firm grip. "I was never trying to be invisible, Petty Officer. I was simply waiting to be seen." She released his hand and walked toward the operations center, where the debrief awaited. Torres followed, carrying the Barrett that had changed the outcome of the morning. Chen watched her go, thinking about all the assumptions he had made in that briefing room. He had looked at her and seen a staff officer, a PowerPoint ranger, someone to be dismissed. He had not seen the years of training, the combat deployments, the record-breaking shots that had made her legend in communities he had never encountered. He would not make that mistake again. 2 days after the ambush, Vasquez sat alone in the Tactical Operations Center, reviewing her after-action report on a secured terminal. The document was thorough, clinical in its precision. 25 enemy killed in action, engagement times logged to the second, ranges and angles recorded for each shot. It read like a technical manual, stripped of the chaos and terror that had defined those minutes in the valley. She saved the file and leaned back in her chair, letting the silence of the empty room settle around her. The FOB had returned to its operational rhythm, the events of 2 days prior already fading into the institutional memory that would preserve them in training materials and tactical assessments. Footsteps approached from the corridor outside. She recognized Webb's gait before he appeared in the doorway, his posture carrying something she had not seen from him before. He entered the room and placed a small object on the table beside her keyboard. A challenge coin, Navy SEAL, trident on one side, the team's operational insignia on the other. The metal was worn at the edges, suggesting it had been carried for years before being offered now. Vasquez looked at the coin, but did not touch it. The team voted, Webb said. Unanimous. That coin represents something we do not give lightly. It means you are one of us, regardless of what uniform you wear or what service claims you on paper. She picked up the coin, feeling its weight in her palm. The gesture carried significance she understood, even if the specific traditions of the SEAL community were not her own. In her world, Marine Scout snipers had their own rituals, their own tokens of acceptance. This was the Navy equivalent, offered by men who had dismissed her 72 hours earlier. I am honored, she said simply. Webb pulled out a chair and sat across from her. His expression had shifted from the formal delivery of the coin to something more personal. I submitted my after-action report this morning, he said. Full account. Every detail of how we drove into an ambush I was warned about, how my arrogance nearly killed my team, how a Marine Staff Sergeant I had dismissed saved all of us. Vasquez set the coin on the table between them. That report will not help your career. Probably not, Webb agreed, but is accurate. And I have spent too many years watching people protect themselves at the expense of truth. He paused, his eyes meeting hers directly. You deserve better than what I gave you in that briefing room. My team deserved better than a commander who let his assumptions override professional intelligence assessment. We all make mistakes, Vasquez said, echoing her earlier words to Chun. The measure is what we do after. Webb nodded slowly. JSOC called this morning. They are not just approving your continued attachment. They are requesting you for a new joint task force being formed specifically for high-value target operations in complex terrain. She absorbed the information without visible reaction. And my current command? Already notified. Webb allowed himself a slight smile. Apparently your commanding officer was not surprised. He said something about wondering how long it would take for someone to figure out what they had. Vasquez thought about Colonel Harrison, her CO back at Camp Lejeune, who had recommended her for this assignment without explaining to anyone what they were actually receiving. He had known exactly what would happen, had probably anticipated that she would face dismissal and disrespect before proving herself in exactly the way she had. The door opened again, and Shin entered carrying 2 cups of coffee. He handed one to Vasquez without ceremony and took a position leaning against the wall. Heard about the task force, he said. Also heard they are looking for operators with mountain warfare experience. Webb raised an eyebrow. Volunteering? Shin shrugged. Figured someone should be there who already knows not to underestimate her. Might save time on the learning curve. Vasquez looked between the 2 men, seeing the genuine respect that had replaced their earlier dismissal. The change had cost blood and fear, had required her to prove herself in the most extreme circumstances possible. But it had happened, and that was what mattered. She picked up the challenge coin again, running her thumb across the trident emblem. Now, wherever you're watching this, think about the times when someone looked at you and saw only what they expected to see. Think about the assumptions people made before you ever had a chance to show them who you really were. And think about what it meant when you finally got that chance, when you proved that their first impression was wrong in ways they never anticipated. That feeling, that moment when competence overcomes prejudice, when actions speak louder than every word that was used to dismiss you. That is what defines a career. That is what defines a life. Vasquez stood, tucking the coin into her pocket where it would remain for years to come. When does the task force stand up? She asked Webb. 72 hours. They want you at Bagram for initial planning by end of week. She nodded, already thinking about the terrain analysis she would need to conduct, the threat assessments she would prepare, the briefings she would deliver to new teams who might look at her the same way Webb and Chun had looked at her 3 days ago. She would give those briefings anyway. She would make her assessments with the same professional precision she always had. And when someone dismissed her, when someone decided she was not worth hearing, she would wait. She would wait to be seen. And then she would show them exactly who they were dealing with.